Hi everyone, welcome to DRAF Live. I'm Ned McConnell, I'm the curator here at DRAF, and today I'm joined by Appau Jnr Boakye-Yiadom and Lloyd Corporation, who I'm really delighted to say are part of our recently announced DRAF Live Art Commission, which is a commission that's been set up in response to the COVID-19 crisis to kind of offer a bit more sustained support for artists who work with performance or live work. So just as a kind of short introduction, Appau joins us. Say hi, Appau.
Hello.
Hey, Appau, how you doing?
Good, good. Do you want me to show you my video as well?
Yeah, why not? Well, let's so everyone can see you.
It's not my video, okay. Hello, everyone.
Great.
Hello.
So Appau is a London-based visual artist. He works across ready-made objects, sound, sculpture, photography archives, and self-produced moving images. And today we'll kind of explore a bit about how those things come together through kind of performative acts, I guess. And then we're also joined by Lloyd Corporation. So Ali and Seb, do you want to just say hi?
Hello. You know, everybody. There's two of us, so there's a double hi on this side, you know?
Yeah, exactly. So Lloyd Corporation is a collaborative project between Ali and Seb, Ali Isa and Sebastian Lloyd Rees. They've been working together since 2010, and their practice kind of encompasses sculpture, installation, performance, participation, and they're often kind of taking inspiration from sort of informal or local economies. So that's a kind of brief introduction to the guys that will be part of the conversation today. And I'm just going to do a bit of housekeeping, so bear with me, and then we'll get into the kind of good stuff. This live talks is part of a partnership with Performance Exchange, which is set up to kind of support live work during lockdown. Performance Exchange is an organisation that's creating cross-sector dialogue around collecting and presenting performance work. And you can find out more about them if you search online for Performance Exchange. So all of these talks, including all the previous ones, have been archived on our YouTube, on our kind of shared YouTube channel. So you can find that through our websites, or if you just go onto YouTube and search for DRAF and Performance Exchange, it should come up. So the next Performance Exchange talk is going to be announced soon, and so definitely keep an eye on Performance Exchange for that. The next DRAF Live will be with Harriet Middleton Baker and Shawana Spong on July the 30th. So yeah, you can find out that through our website. And then finally, the format for artist is going to talk briefly about their work for about sort of 5 minutes maybe. After which, and then we're going to have a chat, and then after that we'll have time for some questions. Can be directed via, there's a little Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, so you can type in questions there, and then we'll go through them at the end. I think that's everything in terms of the housekeeping. So without further ado, I think Lloyd Corporation, Ali, we're going to start with you guys. So do you want to chat a bit about your practice?
Yeah. Thanks, Ned, and thanks, DRAF, for inviting us to take part in this, and looking forward to it. Just give me a second. I'm just going to share my screen so you can see some images. Okay. So we're going to introduce performance work that actually involved sort of 2 iterations over the course of about 3 years. The first one was a performance called The World for Less, which took place in 2014 and was commissioned by the Hayward Gallery as part of a show there that was called Mirror City. And the second iteration of that performance took place at Frieze in London, and that was part of the live projects there commissioned by Frieze, and that was in 2016. And they're kind of we're a kind of connected development, if you like, of a strand of performance in our work, which at the time was relatively new. Just kind of by way of context, Ned, you introduced that me and Seb had been working together since 2010. So it's about 10 years now. So our 10-year anniversary this year, Seb. The first sort of few years of our practice, we primarily been working in sculpture and installation, and kind of, as Ned said, a lot of the work that we began making when we started collaborating was really looking at the kind of effects, I guess, of the financial crisis on the economy, but also on the kind of social and cultural and political landscape. And it was kind of really effective for us because we were studying between 2007 and 2010. So it was right in the kind of heart of that, and the kind of beginnings of austerity politics in the UK. So you could really see that kind of affecting the landscape. So a lot of our early work was actually kind of sculptural and installational, and involved kind of the use of found objects, found materials, and kind of recomposing them in the gallery to kind of ask questions really about you know, the kind of effects and ramifications of this crisis really. And the reason why I'm saying that is because the shift to performance was quite an important moment in the practice, because we felt like we were dealing with incredibly sort of difficult, complex, kind of abstract issues in some ways around economy, and they were kind of highly politicized issues, and yet the gallery space somehow felt somewhat kind of constrained as a space to kind of deal with that. And also a lot of the actual materials that we were gathering for the work came primarily from us kind of walking around in the streets of London, places around our studio, explorations in kind of urban landscapes, finding objects and materials that felt like they could disclose some kind of resonances or kind of histories. And so we were kind of interested in the locations and the sites that these objects came from, but the gallery space kind of erased that to some extent. So we decided to kind of try to think about a more direct way of working that might engage kind of the sites and the kind of the public nature of a lot of the materials that we were gathering. So in 2014, we were commissioned by the Hayward to develop this performance, which was called The World for Less. And we took this starting point of the idea of living statues. So the performance consisted of 3 different characters who we worked with, people from different backgrounds. Some of them were actors. One of them was a dancer. One of them was just someone that we found through one of these kind of precarious work websites, Gumtree. And we were thinking about the kind of everyday performances of or street performers who occupy often public spaces like around the South Bank or around tourist attractions, but are often, you know, these kind of really kitsch, quite gaudy kind of representations or kind of mock performances of a statue, if you like. And we were also kind of interested in it because there's a kind of a contemporary art performance relationship to living statues. So people like kind of Bruce Nauman have engaged with that form, Gilbert and George. So we thought that this might be an interesting form that kind of relates to sculpture, but is doing something very different. But we wanted to make it resonate with some of the kind of political urgencies that we felt were, you know, very prevalent at that time. So instead of kind of creating characters that were, you know, based on some kind of fictional situation, we instead thought about characters that represented kind of people on the kind of margins, if you like. And so we had these 3 different characters. So this was the first one. Seb, whenever you want to just chip in, just like chip in. I'll just take you through the three characters, and then I've got a little bit of video that I'll show you that just gives you a bit of a sense of what the performance was like. So one of them was a sign holder, and this was actually something that was, a lot of our work comes from really directly observed situations that we see in the street. And actually there was a kind of anecdote, because we were really interested in this character in Oxford Street who was holding these signs up for golf sales, and he ended up getting, the shop ended up getting a kind of ASBO ban, because this sign was kind of creating like a kind of visual disruption in Oxford Street. So they got around it by kind of printing a boiler suit which had the name of the shop and an arrow kind of across it, so he could still point to the shop, but he was just wearing a piece of clothing. So we were quite interested in that sort of like idea of the kind of vernacular and like aesthetics that are disruptive, if you like. So within this kind of character, we kind of took the Haywoods, we pointed to the show through this aesthetic, which obviously would be something that an institution would never really commission, right, because of its kind of lack of taste, for want of a better word, and this kind of highly kind of commercialized kind of basic kind of language. A second character was two street vendors, and this was something that we actually had, prior to this work, been making some work that was specifically around kind of counterfeit bags and counterfeit clothing and brands and logos. And it was something that we were always kind of interested in, the way that you know, major kind of big formal economies end up being circulated through these informal kind of illicit kind of trades, and actually what's the relationship between the formal and the informal. But the work also, it was 2014, so it was really the kind of starting point in which the migration crisis began to take on this really urgent and highly visible kind of space in the media. And yet in London, unlike in places like Paris or places like Milan and Rome, we didn't see you know, this situation of kind of West African migrants selling counterfeit bags on the street. So we were kind of thinking this might be a really interesting kind of, quite direct, quite kind of in your face, if you like, form of intervention into a place like the South Bank, which is kind of known for its, like, you know, leisure, it's kind of open leisure space. So this was a kind of second character, and these two guys were actually young theatre actors who are doing various interesting things at the moment as well. And then the third character was another kind of street situation of a kind of precarious street character, if you like, and this was a balloon vendor. And this was taken from the idea of peddlers, which is kind of not really thought about so much as an actual job now, although it still does exist. But peddlers are people that sell wares kind of on their body. And we just kind of also thought about this image of like someone who was kind of almost hidden by this kind of mass of balloons. And this is actually a still from one of the first performances, but it kind of, as the performance went every week for about 3 months, and as it went on, the balloon pile got bigger and bigger, and there was kind of character balloons and all kinds of things. So the person who was playing the role, she was a dancer, and she was kind of holding these balloons and standing in this place. And there's kind of really interesting research behind it in terms of like peddlers being these figures that are under very strict kind of movement regulations that come from the kind of government and the EU. So part of this performance was also about what happens when you start working in public space, what kind of rules and power structures actually do you start rubbing up against. So those were the kind of three characters, and I might just at this point share the video just so you get a bit of a sense of how this kind of worked in real life, and you can get a sense of it. If you give me a second. Okay, so that just gives you a bit of a sense of how it was. So there was quite a few different things that came out of it. I mean, we very much sort of saw the performance as a kind of site-specific kind of research. You know, almost treated it in the way that we would treat an installation. But we spent a lot of time there on the South Bank, and one of the things that came out was about really this kind of invisible kind of rules really in that space, which looks like a public space, but is actually a kind of private space. And the actors and the people that were doing the performing as living statues, they weren't really moving. So there was this kind of play between the idea of a performance as something that's active and is a spectacle, and something that is actually kind of almost invisible in the you know, to people watching. And there was kind of, after every performance we did these quite long kind of interviews with the actors, because they were obviously the ones that had the kind of like main kind of vantage point. And we kind of collected lots of these different responses as to how people interacted with the work. And there was a kind of real mix from, you know, obviously lots of people that completely ignored it and didn't know that it was a performance. They just thought it was a kind of a situation of everyday life. People who kind of did a bit of a double take and kind of thought it was a kind of confusing thing but weren't quite sure what it was, to people that kind of understood that it was an artwork and would make kind of comments or would try to kind of like somehow interact with the performers. The person who was doing the sign holding just got asked lots of questions about where things in the South Bank were, which was kind of quite funny. But probably the kind of major kind of thing that came out of it was that the director of the South Bank saw the street vendors at one point, and when she realized that it was an artwork, basically wanted to kind of shut the performance down because she felt like it was somehow kind of undermining the kind of values of the South Bank. And so for about half of the duration of that work, The World for Less, we were involved in this kind of bureaucratic but really kind of political argument about art and about performance, and about whether performance and art has a meaning if people don't see the work as an artwork and understand its intentions, and kind of like quite, I think, again, quite politicized ideas about space and about kind of security and about who's enabled to be where and when. So that was that work. Seb, I don't know if you've got anything else to add on to that. I'm aware that we're probably going over.
I think if I just jump in, I think that's like a really good summing up of it. But I also think it's kind of a thing which me and Al, over the duration of 10 years, through all of our kind of walks and journeys in the city, something which has become kind of prevalent and also important within the practice, is this kind of interaction and discovery of what is public and private space in the city, and what kind of activities are allowed to occur in spaces which you actually think are public in some sense, and what type of like peddlers or charity events or mobile sellers or even kind of just people sitting there, and we kind of spend a lot of time recording these spaces and also engaging with those spaces. And it's interesting to see how they become curated in some sense. And it's also something which I think London as a city has become more and more kind of engaged with. And that is the kind of visual kind of language which is kind of allowed to be set out as an example for people. And this is also like one of the reasons I think we had the problems at Hayward in some sense, is that Hayward and the South Bank had a kind of very peculiar idea about how they wanted to present themselves as a larger kind of establishment and a place within the city. So I think that's also something which is very vital for the work, and it's something which we kind of investigated for a long time, and always become more and more shocked by the kind of the vast amount which is happening, and a lot of private companies are buying up space within the city which used to be public in some sense, and now it's privately owned, and kind of goes down to a small group of individuals who engage with that, and it's interesting to think about how us as viewers and humans experience these spaces, and how we lose a certain type of freedom as well. So
yeah. I'll just, Ned, really quickly, I'll just show the Frieze ones, and then we can move on to Appau, just to sort of see the difference.
Great.
Really quick. So we redeveloped that performance as a commission at Frieze Live, with kind of some differences in the characters. So there was another sign holder which was kind of using this walking advertising backpack. There was also 2 street vendors. The lady on the right selling champagne wasn't a part of the performance. She was just selling champagne at Frieze Art Fair. But this kind of dynamic was something that we were kind of becoming more and more conscious of the relationship, how the performance blended into the actual setting and the site and the architecture of the space. And we also had a new character, which was these 2 actors who were kind of performing this idea of like a kind of survey or like help information person. So you can see it's a sort of continuation of this kind of precarious role, really, that has is kind of incredibly sort of prevalent in major kind of cities. And the last thing I'll say is just, obviously at Frieze it was kind of much more obvious that it was a performance work. It was much more apprehended as a performance, especially the sign holder. But it kind of created a bit of a different dynamic, which was interesting, which was a sort of intervention and challenge as to how people related to this image as an artwork. So there was a kind of sense of people, whether people were comfortable to actually take an image of this artwork, which was representing something which has like a kind of incredibly sensitive and kind of complex kind of politics behind it. So it kind of functioned as a different kind of intervention, but you know, very different to the public space. But yeah, there's more that we can kind of go into in the chat, but I think we'll kind of end it there and listen to Appau talk about his work.
Great, thanks guys. That's really good kind of context for the discussion later on. So, I mean, I guess without further ado, I'll just hand over to you, Appau, and you can introduce your practice a bit.
Yeah, sure. Hello, everyone. Just thanks for being here. I know it's a very hot day. And yeah, so thanks for your time. Yeah, we can start. Just bear with me for one sec. Okay, so just before, I just got some images and a few videos just to show you, just give you an idea of my practice. But I suppose just to give you background to it, what I usually do is like I use a combinational use of mediums. So I use various mediums, as Ned introduced earlier, from ready-made to my own self-produced moving image work. You know, usually lens-based work, so photography, sounds part of it, sculpture of some kind, and they always take form in this combinational use. What I mean by that is usually there is a sense that they are going from one media to the next. They have this relationship or this interaction with one medium to the next, and it continuously shifts in that way. And that's something that I've been working on. You know, that's sort of that idea, and the performative aspects of my practice is something that I've been exploring since my postgrad, basically. But this particular work I'm going to show you, the settle work, is from my Jerwood silo presentation early last year. And so this body of work, I suppose, gives you a good idea of how all those various aspects of things come together. So previously, before this slide, before this series of work, I was combining this Ross Myers, who's like a sexploitation filmmaker. I was combining that with this 9 colors from Hieronymus Bosch's Garden of Earthly Delight. So this particular work existed in various iterations, where it had, as I say, this combinational use where I had this unzip moment from this Ross Myers video, and that was teamed up with these colors, these 9 colors that were changing on a monitor below. So it was just a very simple connection between these 2 monitors that had this visual, formal connection between the 2 of them. And that then evolved into prints that you saw on the 2 previous slides. That evolved into these prints. And then for the Jerwood show, I combined all the various elements. So this is sweet potatoes in reference to one of the colours of the palette that was used to make the Garden of Earthly Delights by Hieronymus Bosch. And then within the installation, there was this combination of all those various things. So everything is forming, has like a sculptural form, as well as it having this functional and performative aspect to it. So the speakers are working, are there as a sculptural piece, amplifying alongside this 27-inch cube monitor, which lies on the ground. Again, the sound panels out on the wall, again, is a reflection of those colors. The wallpaper, it has this relationship as well. So there's this constant move towards getting things away from talking about something that's more in plurality, and an insistence on plurality, rather than moving away from like an associative connection. So where something's like a singular or totemic in some way. So with this show, I revisited the use of this Ross Myers video, and so I'm really interested in how culture, this idea of culture convergence and its complexities, and how things merge and grow and complicate. And just that's something that's of a keen interest, because of this use of plurality that the sort of sometimes can go and miss within talking about culture and its progression or its evolving. So if we let's go back to the last 2 slides. Yeah, so going back to this idea of performance, what's really useful so I suppose in 2013, I started to use performance quite heavily in the practice alongside these objects. And so they were still used in this sort of sculptural installation, ready-made way. So what you're seeing on the cube monitor, for instance, within this piece at the Joe, what you're seeing in the cube monitor is I've extracted an audio from a video of where I've been recording various aspects of the drum kit, but excluding the performer. So you're seeing just these various angles you get from like a standard drum kit. And again, it's this idea, drum kit is something that is a combination of cultures being brought together to make an entire kit. And there's this idea as well of this cultural, so there's that combination, but there's also this merger, and its amplification, and this audio is also this idea of a universal, of some kind of universal experience of some kind. So what happened with this drum kit, as well as it forming as a sculptural piece, along with the speakers, it gets reassembled into a drum kit. So as it's disassembled, it's forming this shelf to raise the height of the speakers, but then it gets reassembled on the second half of this space. So if you look to the left of the slide, you can see there's this black area. So we took off the sound panels and formed a wall in which, when the drum was reassembled on that side, you couldn't access the performer. There was this, there was no route to performer. And that cube monitor was placed on this red freestanding wall, was placed at the bottom of it. And you were getting a live feed of the performance, again, excluding the performer from the live performance. And so what was on the monitor before, this being audio extracted from a previous drum recording, after this performance was made. So if we go to the slides of the videos, so yeah, the performer was in this space here, and everything is sort of reassembled, and So when the viewer arrived in the space, the performance they were seeing was this concealed drummer, in which I was recording various aspects of the drum kit, and they were being amplified live. But the viewer can only see what's happening through this 27-inch cube monitor on the ground, and just hearing that, and all you're getting is this live sound that's of something happening on the other side of this room or this wall. And there's this thing about, I suppose, the concealing of the performer as well. It has this relationship where I'm quite interested in how, like, the performance, and which we'll talk a little bit more about in a minute, but this idea of the performer as like an appeaser, and the viewer, the viewer as the counsel almost. So there's this standard relationship between the two, the two people, and that sort of the idea of the images you create of certain roles, and the sort of phantom images, and the whole practice was exploring that. My whole practice exploring that, and sort of questioning those various aspects of signifiers, or trying to break that sort of idea of associative thinking. So yeah, I don't know if we could play that video. Yeah. And so as this was happening, this was being recorded. So this was actually forming another aspects of the work, which is usually, as I say, most of the work is quite iterative and quite generative. So what the viewers are actually seeing is something that gets reinstated into the work and becomes a new aspect of the exhibition. So the previous video that was shown in the installation prior to this was removed, and this was replaced with it. And that's what most things go through. It goes through this sort of transition, or this constant motion, and this idea of, again, it's in relation to cultural practices, and it coming from its messiness as well as its allure. You know, this idea that things coming from various angles, as well as not moving away from a sort of singular idea of how things come into being, almost, and the sort of cultural connection it's had through conversation. So it's evolving through interaction as well. I think I'll end it there and start a conversation.
Yeah. Great. Thanks, Appau. That's really great to hear a bit more in depth about your practice, but specifically those performance works from Jerwood. And I mean, I guess we've been talking about a few areas of discussion, and what kind of came up to me just then actually was, we've talked a bit about kind of power structures in both your practices, and how you relate to those, or how you try to address those or reveal them in some way. And it seems to me like it's interesting, Ali, that you mentioned the kind of conversations with the South Bank, specifically about what those performances were they allowed to be there, were they kind of on brand? And Appau, it seems to me like in your performances particularly, you're kind of inhabiting a space in some way, and you're choosing what you let the audience see and what they don't see. So I wonder if we could start with maybe having a conversation about those kind of power structures, but also, and Ali, I suppose one thing that I wanted to ask you was, obviously, Appau, with your performances, the audience are to a certain extent aware of those kind of things being set up, like they're aware they're not allowed in a certain part of the room, or that there is something that's not being revealed to them totally. Ali, can you talk about the conversation? I don't know how much you can talk about the conversations, but certainly you could maybe talk about how that changed the work in some way, or made you think differently about the work whilst the work was actually kind of in situ.
Yeah, sure. I mean, Yeah, I just actually really connected with something that Appau said previously about the work being generative, and performance not being a kind of singular event but a generative process, because I think that's a really good description of that piece that we showed, The World for Less, and maybe more so with the first iteration, because I think, and Seb, I don't know what you make of this, but I think we mainly thought when we did that it was the first time we'd ever used performance in our practice. So we kind of, we didn't, it was kind of an experimental thing, right? And we went into it, I think, much more focused on the relationship between the public and the performers, and what would happen in that interaction. And I think we were thinking about it, obviously, because the characters were representing actual observed kind of social situations and identities and bodies, that this was a kind of way of kind of almost exploring and researching social interaction, around these really kind of difficult, quite problematic kind of political kind of concepts, like how do we relate to, migrants selling counterfeit bags, for example, and there's those kind of things. So I think for me, the way that it began to build and become kind of generative of all these other interactions around an institution, around, like what Seb was saying before, the kind of rules and laws around public space, all of that was like completely not expected. I genuinely did not think that the Hayward would like start saying, you need to put a sign next to the performer because people might think that this is a real thing. So it was a totally unexpected thing that I think in a way began to make me look a bit further into, ways in which kind of theatre, political theatre in particular, has actually used this mode as a way of kind of breaking through the kinds of boundaries between viewers and subjects. So something that we began to kind of research and look into was the work of Augusto Boal and the theatre of the oppressed, and particularly a particular form within that, which is called invisible theatre, where there are unexplained happenings within the social that hope to kind of make people relate differently to a particular problem or social issue or community issue, and they're not explained, and that's kind of part of the kind of power of them. So in a way, I guess in answer to your question, it was an unexpected kind of rubbing up against power structures, but then it felt actually like a really kind of poignant and actually quite successful way of like intervening in a situation so that the structures became visible. And like, just one anecdote quickly, the best night was on the night of the private view, because basically the South Bank has got this like really labyrinth-esque sort of shift pattern of security guards. So there was one group of security guards that got briefed, and there was another group that didn't, and then they went on a change during the private view. So what ended up happening was that one group started calling on the microphones, oh, there's some guys selling bags, they're selling bags like outside the Hayward Gallery, like we're gonna go and like shut it down. And then they came down with like flashlights, and then John, who was one of the performers, was kind of like waving at me like, what's going on? It just kind of went mad. And then I was, so we just ended up in these kind of situations that were not expected.
I just to point in it as well, Al, I also think it's kind of, as Al was saying, is we didn't go into the situation with the thought of challenging the kind of institution in any formal way. I think the institution, in some sense or form, started challenging the work in many ways due to the kind of power structures which were set up in the South Bank. And that also made us much more kind of prevalent and aware of how South Bank was operating as a kind of pseudo kind of public space in a lot of ways. And we had a lot of conversations with individuals at the South Bank, which there is no need to mention names about censoring the work, for example, to some extent. And that also led into wider kind of discussions about how the South Bank is a space which is for the public, and there's also been, the huge kind of debate and engagement about the skate park as well in the South Bank, what that was meant to be and how that's been kind of locked down in some sense. Also the kind of like availability of peddlers and homeless people operating at South Bank, and that's something which the South Bank was very, very engaged with us in that sense, that when we kind of challenged them on the idea that this wasn't public space and it wasn't functioning in the way in form we saw it, they were saying, the South Bank was also operating as a place where people which were in difficult needs and finding themselves on the street, they would come to the South Bank and house themselves, in the late hours and things. So it kind of ended up being quite quite a big investigation and conversation in some sense, which, as Al said, went on for quite a long time, for the duration of the show. And I guess it's also when you start working within inside the kind of art institutional kind of setting, and the art institutional setting has a hierarchy above it, and that hierarchy starts to get engaged with the conversation about what is kind of liberated and free and what is censored and not censored. There's a lot of different opinions about it in that way. It's also important to point out that me and Al also, because we did an installation in a part of the cafe at the Hayward, we handed out free advertising to a company which is called Labara Mobile, which was worth quite an extensive amount of money. And then we got kind of challenged by the South Bank that they've been engaging with the Labara for almost a year about Labara sponsoring the South Indian Festival, and we just handed away free advertising and destroyed the whole marketing communication deal. So I guess things like that is also the prevalent and the kind of fuel for the work as well. We always enjoyed finding ourselves in these kind of situations, and we engage with them also. So
Appau, like maybe you could talk a bit about those types of, certainly the kind of generative aspects of that, but also the kind of the way you see the kind of relationships you're setting up, or the negotiations between yourself, the collaborator, the audience within those performative elements of your practice.
Yeah, I suppose with me it's just like I wanted to sort of stay remove. I suppose it all starts with removing the performer. Once I decide to move them away from the center of the whole thing, there's this questioning about as well. Like this, that's what I mean, but understanding certain bodies in certain places, in certain spaces, and performance is one of those cultural areas where there's this expected body in certain, it could be doing certain things almost, and I sort of wanted to remove that because I sort of see that as a bit of a privilege in some ways to the to the audience, in that way. It's removing that idea of like this preconceived or associative idea of the person you're seeing in front of you. So it was more about, I suppose, in terms of like that, it was a natural thing, because I suppose, especially with the earlier performance work I was doing, or performative, as Ned you were saying, it's like more performative than performance. It was very much, I was in that space. I was very much the instigator of certain things happening. And I understood that there was this whole understanding of like performance art, let's say, with having black bodies and performance art. So initially it was like a move away from that, and having this understanding, or having that sort of, having those sort of bodies in certain spaces, and trying to move away from just the audience having that sort of privilege in some way. So for me doing that, for me having these setups where the biggest part of it was improvisation that allowed that to happen, because I understood you know, performance for me was very much about understanding this conversation that happens it's very much a live thing. So it's a conversation that's happening with you or another, and understanding how culture itself sort of evolves from that live discussion. And so I wanted to put that into the work in terms of really talking about how things evolve or mutate through that interaction, but, you know, getting rid of that body that does that. So it's,
I think there's actually a good question that's come in that Ali just brought to my attention that relates quite specific to what you just said and also what Ali and Seb were just saying. And maybe we'll start with you, Appau, but Kate's interested to hear more about the role of the performers in Lloyd Corporation's work, but I want to start with you because I think it's relevant here as well. She says, in light of the general disrupting or questioning of power structures, but also the experience of the performers as key to the output and ownership of the work outside of the artist's role. So maybe you can talk a bit about your relationship with your collaborators and what their role is in terms of authoring the work, but also in terms of the ownership of it, I guess, and especially given that they're kind of hidden to a certain degree. And then we can go back to you, Ali and Seb, and talk about the same thing.
Yeah, so again, it's like, so they're improvising. So this idea of them being hidden is I'm interested in how things evolve from how cultural areas or any sort of cultural or social progression or movement, basically, any sort of movement comes from that interaction with people. And so this idea of improvisation for me is with that live aspect, you involve the performance for me is responding to a very loose set of guidelines. So they're essentially just responding to the space, and they're responding in that moment. But what's interesting is how when you do that it has an aspect of what's happening now. So that might be the technology that, you know, that's involved in that sort of interaction, but it's like languages that evolve from, you know, language that evolves like street languages of some kind, or slang in any sense. It's a conversation that happens that evolves those languages, rather than it coming from an institution of saying this is the right words to use for this sort of thing. And so that's another way for me, putting that in an art context, that was a way for me to sort of understand those or sort of explore those ideas by including somebody that improvises, because then it moves it away from, not the obvious thing, it moves away from my centers conversation, but it also understands that, like, you know, I'm not, that the input that's needed into making something, it breaks up this idea of singularity, in which although I'm sort of instigating this, I'm very much interested of seeing another perspective to the same thought.
Great. Yeah. I mean, I think language is a really good example of that in terms of the way that it tends to develop. And I know we're gonna go back and talk a bit more about improvisation in a bit. So maybe Ali and Seb, just throw that question over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I would sort of build on what Appau was saying around improvisation, because I think to kind of to give you the kind of the straightforward answer really to Kate's question, it was the kind of the ownership of the work in terms of, or its kind of authorship, if you like, kind of remained with us. It was named as a Lloyd Corporation work, and so, you know, obviously the performers were like credited within that, but in some respects we very much had the kind of relationship of the artist who developed the kind of work or the idea for it, and then we worked with the performers. Actually, through a friend of ours who works in writes and is an actor and performs in theatre. There was quite a number of rehearsals that we did in the kind of whole process. So in a way, there was a kind of slightly more direct directorial role. But then I think what happened in the process, and this is where the improvisation comes in, you know, we did this every week on the South Bank for 3 months. So you can kind of imagine that, like, within this, in a way, quite strict script for actors of like being a living statue, it was quite a process for them to kind of grasp the idea that it wasn't about kind of acting in the sense of like performing something, but it was more about embodying an actual situation and an actual kind of observation and character. So that was where a lot of the work came in these kind of rehearsals that we did and kind of activities. But where the improvisation came in is that we began to just give them kind of like free rein after 2 or 3 weeks to just go and find places. So in the South Bank, they were kind of going all over the place, and we didn't always know where they were. And then that was the same at Freeze as well. And at Freeze, they were also much more, it was like quite difficult to get them to actually do the living statue thing. So like one of the guys in particular, the guy who was one of the people selling the bags, he just went completely rogue, and he was just like selling stuff, and like he just like completely went for it. And then we were kind of like, okay, well, I guess this is what this is becoming now. So there was this kind of sense in which over time, and because of the durational kind of quality of it, and kind of going back to the thing that Appau said about the work actually being generative instead of being this kind of singular event, you know, it started to kind of fray and like lose its structure. And then the other element of it,
just to jump in, sorry, just to jump in just quickly on one thing, because I think it's kind of important, like going back to the conversation which was raised earlier. It's also one of the reasons why I think me and Al shifted away from the idea of having a studio practice and being two individuals in a studio making work, and kind of removing ourselves to the outside, because I think that's where, of course, a lot of the conversations generated between me and Al already back in 2007 in some sense. But it's also when we started engaging with space outside of the studio, the kind of like the unknown became a much kind of wider kind of discourse within the practice. With actors to regular people to just kind of life itself in some sense. And it's also, it fuels and embodies the work as well. Like, it's not like you're two individuals making a singular work in an encapsulated closed space. There is always the kind of gesture of something happening. And I think that's become something really, really, really important inside the practice as well. And it's something which we were trying to investigate even more and more, and also kind of having the capacity to give freedom to other kind of people within inside the practice as well. I think that's also something which is really, really crucial, and we really want to be open for that in that sense.
And there was kind of part of that actually was like, I was saying we did these interviews with the actors afterwards, and actually for me, kind of reflecting on that work, I think that was potentially one of the most interesting elements of it, because we made a publication for the World for Less project, which was a quite big book, and in that there was a kind of full transcription of this dialogue, because what sort of became apparent really was that this process that was quite sort of strange and alien for people that were, you know, actors or weren't actors, dancers, whatever, of kind of being in the environment, not performing, not directly kind of overtly engaging with the audience, became a kind of practice of observation, and that became shared in these dialogues. So we had these really, really interesting conversations with them afterwards about, you know, kind of social dynamics, about interaction, about, you know, economy, about public space. All of that kind of rich stuff I think me and Seb would say is like absolutely a part of the work, and their voice was very much kind of like constitutive of that, because we didn't know what was really going on a lot of the time, because they were seeing it and we were kind of like, you know, 15 meters away, you know, trying to sort of look at it or film it a bit, but stay out of it to not kind of encroach on the lived experience of encountering those people.
And Appau, just, I mean, I guess like a lot of this stuff is around, and we've talked about this before, this kind of idea of like contingency within performative work, as in there's always a lot of kind of unknowns, and it feels like your practice is partly built on that idea that, you know, that partly the generative aspects of it rely on there being some kind of unknown sort of point in the future that you're going to get to, and then maybe use that work, that sort of material in the future iterations of the work. But also, I guess there's something relational within that around the audience and what the audience is bringing in that moment, but then also what they're going to bring in the future.
Well, I suppose with the audience as well, it's just I suppose a lot of the performances of recent has been percussion. So with that position in which you're giving the audience that it's taking, because I suppose with percussion, it relies on this sort of an experience. It's sort of grown on this experience, and you know, various things. You know, there's some especially things like drum kits. As I was saying previously, it's like this relation to the sort of heartbeat, and so you tend to have this. It's pushed towards the sort of immersive in some way, or you have this. I hate it. I love it or I hate it. You know, you have to. You know, it's so. Especially that sort of sound, the volume of it, and it being live and being created. It's you sort of. It sort of becomes this. It becomes very sensory in that way. So the audience takes that position and sort of. I would like to push that in some ways. I mean, I can't say what people are going to come and feel, but you know, the idea is that you know you have this push towards a collective experience rather than a viewing. Well, you know, rather than beyond the viewing of that experience. You know, beyond this that relationship of that very that line that's crossed. That's what I mean about it. I don't know, I can't think of a better word, but like that messiness. I like that idea that, just understanding things that are constantly in this collision, constantly going through each other. But what's important about that is this sense of movement. And that's what I mean about when things come from a place where they, once it's improvised, what I should say is like, so what I should say is a thing about when the performers are used to improvise, usually they tend to be musicians. I try to avoid using people that have sort of experience within the art world, because then it's, you can get loads of people that play percussions, for instance, that are within the art world, or, there's loads of bands, various, so but you have a sense of, they have a sense of knowledge to that sort of thing. I really want a conversation or another take on what I'm saying, or what I think I'm saying, what I think I'm doing. And that sort of autonomy it also gives the performer autonomy when there's this wall behind which they're performing. They don't have to, they're not considering presenting something, they're actually also feeling something as well. And hopefully that feeds into the audience in some way, what they're generating,
I think that idea of messiness is really, really kind of apt, I suppose, because, all these kind of spaces that we're talking about, particularly public spaces, particularly where there's performance happening, are quite messy. There's a lot of different people, there's a lot of different kind of politics going on, there's a lot of different, even just personal spaces happening. And I think there's definitely something there within public space, obviously is kind of inherently like that. And there's a series of kind of negotiations that happen unconsciously or consciously around how you navigate those spaces. And I think improvisation, I think, is a really interesting one with that, particularly when you have more than one improviser, say, because they're obviously working out with each other which direction to go in and how to play off of each other. Ali and Seb, I wonder if, in terms of your just thinking about the contingent nature of performance, how, and the fact that with your performances, similarly, Appau's, there's a lot going on and there's a lot changing and kind of in flux. I wonder, like, where you consider the audience within that. And then I think after this point we'll go to some questions, because I realise it's 6:05. I've been too into the chat, and then yeah, we'll take some questions from the audience at that point.
I mean, I think, you know, I was just sort of really interested in what Appau was saying about the work generating a collective experience, and kind of thinking about how you know, movement, but also kind of percussion and certain kinds of affects can generate this kind of shared experience, but also that experience is kind of embodied. And I think that was something that we kind of thought about as well in thinking about staging these very kind of like politicized but often very mediated images. So, you know, particularly the street vendors, which was kind of the first idea that we had in this line of work. You know, it was this image that we were just in some ways so kind of desensitized to, because we were seeing it within this kind of like very particular kind of form of like violent, you know, news media image. So we kind of really wanted to make that an embodied, connected experience that people might be affected by, and that might be able to lead to some kind of like, whether it's a kind of raising of kind of political consciousness, or whether it was other things. You know, it could have easily gone a different direction. That's the contingency. But I think that's where we first thought of the audience. But then I think as that work developed over time, to me, kind of the notion of audience became quite dispersed and kind of like confusing. It doesn't even really make sense for that work to some extent, because there was like, you know, an institutional thing. There was, you know, us and our relationship to the actors. There was people who would just completely walk past the performance and not necessarily see it, or what, you know, came up in these kind of conversations about potentially kind of censoring the work, was what they were really scared of was people who would walk past it, see it, think that it was actual street vendors, and then walk off and go away with some sort of like warped kind of idea of, I don't know, something. So I think to me, like, audience this all began to become much more messy, as you were saying before. I don't know what you think, Seb, if you have any other thoughts on that, on the idea of the audience in that.
I think you kind of pointed out quite well. I also think it's like what Al was saying as well. I think it also has a lot to do with the kind of social construction within the space that the performance is being presented in some sense. And I remember like a very peculiar moment when we were doing the performance at Frieze at the opening day, and we had been kind of designated these very peculiar places for the performance to occur and happen. They wanted to censor for the early hours of the VIP, the bag vendor at the main entrance of Frieze, for peculiar reasons, and I'm not really sure until this day what that was anyway. But within the next kind of like 2 minutes after the opening, the bag vendor got approached by somebody who was basically interested in not buying the bag. They were interested in buying the performance and the character in some sense. So it generates quite a strange kind of a social discourse to the people which engage with it in a lot of ways. And it also becomes quite fascinating and interesting, like sociological kind of like research as well in that concern to how people engage with it. You know, as Al was saying as well, like with one of the sign vendors at the South Bank, most people would come to him and ask for directions. Where was the toilet? Where was the entrance? How did that function? How did this function? So I think those things are quite prevalent for the work as well. But it's definitely also the kind of the unknown as well, which are also quite, as I said, quite important for the work. It's you don't know what's going to happen within the next 5 minutes, and I think, as Al was saying, also with the freeze characters and the kind of actors, they were much more willing and much more kind of engaged, I would say, and they also came from a theater or movie background, so they also had a different approach to audience. So yeah.
I think like one other thing, it kind of connects a little bit there to one of the questions about like the work being anthropological, because I think like something we've explored actually in a work that we did 2 years ago with the South London Gallery with the youth group there called the Art Assassins, is we were looking at social experiments, and we were doing these kind of public interventions, and they were being recorded, and it was all about kind of, again, interaction, public space, and various other things. So I think for us, like we've weirdly enough, we've never really thought about it as performance. We've thought about it in lots of other different ways. So like we've thought about it as intervention, as like institutional critique, as sculpture or installation, most recently as kind of social experiments, and all of these different forms, you know, they all involve the live interaction of people. They all involve thinking about kind of experience and behavior. But, you know, there's many different distributions of what the kind of roles are within that, including like the artist role within that as well, you know, which kind of took us into different places. So in some ways, the kind of the convention of like audience and performer, I think in our work, it's more kind of complex really than that, or it takes different forms and different kind of lenses, which is what I enjoy about it, because it allows you to kind of think about the issues which are kind of at the core of the work in different ways and kind of bring different kind of light to it, really.
I think, like, just to jump in as well, there's somebody who asked in a question about like what other forums we kind of engage with as well, and going back to what Al was saying in some sense about like the artist's role as well, is I think definitely over the kind of last few years, like with working within inside of the Lloyd Corporation, there's multiple times when me and Al kind of disembark from the artist role and kind of take on a completely different type of structure. That could be a kind of more of a pseudo kind of investigator, or just, you know, some jolly good old fella who's going up to the north of England to have a great chat with somebody and pick up some poles, and you don't really talk that much about art. You talk about the kind of life as it is, and what's between that. And I think that's something which it's kind of important as well when you work on the outside, that you don't bring always the artist with you into these conversations, because I think it shuts down a lot of possibility for engagement with the people that you're interested in having conversations with. And it's like a piece which we did in 2018, which was called Local to Global, which was an investigation of a cryptocurrency which was called OneCoin. And we went undercover for almost a year's period to investigate this cryptocurrency, and it was all filmed by spy camera, and we started going to all these events. And at that kind of stage, you disembark from being an artist. I think you become something very different, and I think that's kind of the beauty as well with the practice and the possibility of it. That's at least my thought, you know. You can mutate into a lot of different things.
Okay, so I think that's probably covered one of the questions that we've got, and I'm going to sort of squeeze the other two questions into one question, because they're both kind of related to the digital. So I guess what these two questions are wondering is, what are your thoughts on kind of the digital within performance. Specifically, one is asking what your thoughts are on the kind of privatization of online space, and do you think there's a way to address that in a similar way to how you, Ali and Seb, have been addressing the privatization of public space IRL, in real life. And then the other one is really trying to think through different digital tools. So, and I think this is maybe more applicable to you, Appau, around, have you thought much about using digital things like AR as like an interactive tool to be able to engage with the audience, or the ways that the digital can be used to archive material and like the audience experience for live performance within digital realms? Should we start with you, Appau, on that one?
I could, well, the latter question, I suppose, is more when you, I suppose, like digital tools and things like AI and things. I'm really interested in how those things are used by us and how they move away from their intended use. So, you know, like how they, so you end up with areas that are a bit more unexpected to how they were intended, you know, how they're first intended. And that's, I suppose that, again, it comes back to this, comes back to a social or cultural interaction with these things. So with me, so with that said, I think with me, it's more, I think more about things in terms of how we use these tools, like, you know, how, you know, I love the fact that, like, you know, the least expected area of society might have a completely different take as to AI to what we may think it is, because we have a certain conversation around that. And that, for me, is more interesting than the actual tool itself. I don't know. And I can't remember the prior question. I hope that answers that.
I think that, you know, that was good. I mean, I think like you're kind of saying that you're more interested in reflecting on the way these things are used by society, I suppose, rather than how you might specifically use them in your work. That's led by the way other people use them in real life or in, you know, in society. Yeah,
because it's a that's what I mean about movement. I think it's a very much a social and cultural one, and where it's just trying to think of ways as an artist to open up the conversation of where things not being one thing, you know, things coming from, as I say, things coming from or coming to existence from various interactions, and constantly shifting and constantly moving away from what you might perceive them to be. And that's, so my interest is more lies in that sort of experiencing things, because, you know, who's to say what that will be in 30 years time? It will probably be something, you know, completely different. I'm quite,
Great. And Ali and Seb, do you want to briefly touch on this, the ideas around the privatization of online space? I mean, it's a pretty big question, but maybe you can just give some thoughts.
What do you think, Al? What can we say about privatization of the online space?
You go for it, Seb.
I'm the wizard on privatization of online spaces. There is positive and negative factors on both sides of the fence. Like the World Wide Web is a free source at the end of the day, but it has been monetized and privatized for years and years and years in that way. And of course, it's really important with freedom of speech and to kind of have a very openness to it and to be very liberal about it. But I also think we see per day that it can also have tremendously negative impacts. You know, I don't think we need to go any further than to go to, you know, Donald Trump's kind of Twitter feed, like the first president ever in the history of America, which has utilized technology to that extent, because it's available and it's kind of it's there, you know. But luckily there is also privatization involved in it, and that means that, you know, they started to shut down some of his feeds as well, and then to close some of the conversation. So without privatization, then that wouldn't really occur in that sense. Then it would just be one big kind of wish-wash. But it's a really deep and vast kind of subject, I would say.
Yeah, I think the project that we mentioned before, about working with the young people at South London Gallery, that actually addressed kind of privatized digital experiences quite directly. And in a way, I actually kind of connect a bit with what Appau said around the rather than maybe a kind of direct engagement with how you might use AI or digital tools, but a kind of reflection on the way those things are being used. Because that project we did with this group of young people was about opening up conversations with people about issues around privacy. And it was actually at the time of kind of all the GDPR regulations coming in. So we were having this conversation with them as young people, you know, like, you know, questions about to what extent do you care about privacy, or you know, the kind of privatization of kind of spaces and the kind of impact of companies harvesting your data. Like, it was about opening up those questions, and then they wanted to, you know, make a kind of intervention performance in public that opened up those conversations with members of the public. So I kind of think that, I think that's the way that we've addressed it in our work so far, but also how I would kind of probably think about continuing to address it, which is like a really important space that I think for kind of contemporary work, which is to be able to open up conversations from different kind of angles and different vantage points, and to allow kind of conversations that might not have taken place take place. And I think that's what kind of art can do quite often, and that happened a lot with that project, because it was sort of young people talking to older people about their relationship to, you know, to digital or to the kind of privatization of those spaces. So I think that's kind of probably my like thought on it, really. I'm not sure. I think that the way that we approached the work in the South Bank and the kind of intervention in public space was obviously very like specifically orientated around the body in public, and in public space. So I guess whatever happens in relation to online spaces and that kind of disruption of those forms of like capital accumulation, basically, and like, you know, rights kind of infringement, you know, I guess it will have to have a different kind of form to it. But I definitely think it's necessary. I mean, it's shocking when you start seeing the kind of the kind of colonization of online spaces and the kind of the accumulation of wealth in relation to it. It's absolutely kind of one of the most important kind of rights issues at the moment. So yeah, absolutely.
I was just going to say, yeah, I was just going to say, to add to that, it's also just how much is done online, how much is being created, and how much different voices, how, you know, voices outside of the mainstream. That's, you know, this hence why it's probably wants to be policed. You know, this is, you know, this is a place where people can find those various voices, you know, and that exist outside of the mainstream. And for me, you know, that informs my work quite heavily in one way or another. You know, most of the things that I am referencing have gone through that avenue of not necessarily obscurity of any kind, but like in terms of how people operate, how people use that how people use that to best advantage, how you're finding certain voices that just, you know, just wouldn't be given up, you know, just wouldn't have space for on a mainstream platform, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I think absolutely, and you know, there's lots, you can see lots of examples of how that's generating a very diverse kind of field of conversation that's now penetrating into the real world, if you like. But I think we could probably do a whole nother hour and a half or so on this subject. So I think it's probably time to call it a day. So I just want to say thanks to Appau, Seb and Ali for your time and your generosity talking about your practices and all the areas that we covered. And yes, really looking forward to carrying on our conversation about your commissions.
Cool. Thanks,
well, thank you guys. Thanks
Hey,
everyone
for coming and listening in to us. You know, a pleasure.
On such a warm, sunny evening as well. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very warm.
Yeah, let's look at it.
Take care.
Yeah.
All right, take care.
See you. Bye.